All right, I think we're waiting for people to join. Oh, people starting to join. All right, hello everyone. We're just gonna wait. We'll do the kind of like the high school passing time thing. I think wait about 2 minutes before we officially kick off. But it's good to see people joining now. Hope everyone's having a nice. Is it Wednesday? Wednesday morning? Yeah, Wednesday. Excellent. But yeah, we'll start at I don't know. We'll give it like another 1 minute before diving in. All right, we'll start going. People can catch up later if they miss some things. Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Lesson. I'm one of the co-founders of Fin Analytics, and we're here today to talk about specifically remote work optimization and kind of the crazy new world we live in, where observability of teams that are now, in a lot of cases, more distributed is becoming super important. And specifically, how people have been using our Fin Analytics platform successfully to drive real results and impact in this kind of newly remote world, both from an efficiency standpoint and also just like kind of core bread and butter coaching and things like that that has to go on in an operations team. I'm going to boot up a deck and kind of walk you through that and also kind of take you through the live tools, hopefully just for some context here, and we'll go from there. So I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. Um, yeah, so again, from a discussion agenda today, where we're going to go over the following topics. We'll talk a little about how we build a complete continuous data set of teams' work. It's basically what it means to have real observability, right? So it's become a huge topic recently into your operations work that allows you to do a lot of optimization on top. Talk about how Fin works, a little bit of how we unlock value for organizations, and then kind of the key insights that we drive around that, and specifically like the remote work angle, which has just become a huge percentage of what we do for companies. Honestly, it's like you got to be nimble to the market, and this has become a huge theme. Um, we'll talk secondly about kind of the value of observability and performance optimization in a few ways. One around debugging utilization capacity on like an individual and sub-team level, thinking about like things like true handle time and why it's more actionable than average handle time. This is like one of my personal crusades against average handle time as a meaningful and important metric and moving towards a more sophisticated approach. We'll talk a little about process exploration around continuous improvement and then monitoring remote issues around security, compliance, technology, et cetera. I'll show you kind of a demo of kind of Fin for an operations team and the kind of doing that. We'll talk a little about how we approach continuous improvement, which is kind of a methodology we've developed in concert with our tools, and then leave some time for Q&A at the end. So diving right in, let me just, for those of you who don't know or kind of new to our tools, let's just talk about kind of what Fin does. So like our whole philosophy is that obviously junk in, junk out. And if you want to really think about observability and driving operational improvements, you need complete process instrumentation that tells you how each task is completed by each of your team members on a continuous basis. We basically do big data time and motion studies on an ongoing basis for teams with a full click stream plus video and audio recording. And then really importantly, we segment that both by person and by case so you can actually do deep introspection on the data. We take that, we provide immediately actionable operations insights. These are a lot of like our standard dashboards, which follow our methodology. And, a lot of teams that use our services out of the box see dramatic efficiency gains, with their remote teams as well as their in-house teams from using our tools. And then, we're huge believers in the quantitative plus qualitative. We are huge data first people, but the reality is no matter how good your data is, it is important to be able to pop open, a session or a case and replay exactly what you've seen before. Screen recording isn't new, but historically the problem with it's been like, it's not very impactful when you don't know where to look. With our data, we kind of tell you where to look, but then also let you do the looking. When you think about like what really makes Fin Analytics different and more powerful, it is really the fact that we can look at again this entire data stream across all your tools out of the box. So, there are a lot of people who like provide analytics for just your CRM, but we look at all your tools. And that really is important given the fact that most teams, are actually using their CRM or their system of record, for 35 to 45% of the time because they have documents and knowledge base, they have, internal tools, et cetera. So when you think about what this actually means, like there's two things I like to point out to people. One is kind of this idea of active page events. This is like the core of how we do a lot of analysis, where we understand using some sophisticated logic when a case starts and then when a case ends, and then each case session within the case start and case end done by a different person. And we know, again, what's happening in the CRM. We're able to look at the docs, knowledge base, et cetera, and understand the time in a continuous basis. The second is DOM events. So like within each of these applications or each of these sub sessions, effectively, there's obviously things happening. There's buttons being clicked, boxes edited, et cetera. Because of the way our technology works at the browser level, we can instrument all the way down to the keystroke on specific text boxes to understand, okay, like these responses are being written and rewritten continuously, et cetera. But I think like the thing I keep in mind is like, this is obviously jumping pretty deep, pretty fast, but like the key thing and our key mantra and philosophy is start with a complete data set that you have the right information to work with, have it normalized and cleaned in a way that allows you to drive actionable insight and then go from there. In terms of the actionable insight, again, like when you think about like how we unlock value, there's like a few key areas or things we address. The first is obviously the people component. Any team is made up of a set of people, could be hundreds, it could be dozens, could be hundreds, could be thousands, right? And one of the most important things to understand is that your people are always on every single workflow or instance going to kind of fit into a distribution. It's not like the average is what's actually going on. Within, you can identify what the top 20% of people are doing or how they're working on a specific case type or overall from an engagement perspective. To understand the average, then you can talk about the value of closing those gaps. We work a lot on processes. In a process case, any process you have, they're going to be outliers. And actually, the reality is that sometimes those outliers are going to be so extreme that they'll swamp any other insight you'd have into what's going on in the process. So we actually focus our analysis around the P30, so the 30th percentile case to the 70th in terms of time taken, and understand how to drive down the cost of that and the value from that perspective. Tools, for almost any team, they're going to use a bunch of different tools completing every single case. You want to target the biggest opportunities based on either like abnormal tool usage or just like the biggest slices of time, right? It's a good example of where to look. Outliers, again, this is a super obvious set of analyses we do for most people. If you've been around operations teams, it's probably unsurprising that the top 5% of cases, the slowest cases, for most teams take 25 to 35% of their overall time. So targeting those, understanding what scenarios they occur in, which people are driving them, et cetera, is a huge value. And then finally, there's like the targeted automation component, which is, everyone's excited about, a lot of people are excited about automation broadly. The question is, what's the process you're automating and what are you targeting? We're able to target very specifically, the right cases. So not even necessarily the average way a process is done, but the way a process is done by the best people under the right circumstances to find points for automation. The overall vision, and I'll go through this before diving into kind of a more specific tool walkthrough, and then we'll talk about some of their coaching stuff, is kind of like this, which is, if you think about the way operations works today, people work on their CRMs, they work on their knowledge bases, internal tools, messaging, meetings, whatever. There's like all this activity going on. What's missing is like a standard consistent layer of data that's clean that allows you to then do a bunch of the higher level functions every company needs to do, like FP&A, training employees, coaching and QA, whatever they're doing on Six Sigma or process improvement, automation, workforce management, on top of a common, correct, and complete data layer. These applications all exist today. They're all done with partial data. They're all done kind of in different ways. And like our view is that the future has to be and will be kind of having a standard, consistent, trustable layer that drives a lot of these activities to much better outcomes. So we're going to get into the remote team component because that is kind of the key of what's going on right now. And I think honestly, like, been sadly a huge boon for our business because I think people have come to from this is intellectually important to this is practically important. I'm going to walk you through effectively how our tools actually work with a demo organization. And I think you'll kind of start to understand kind of how they fit into this remote work narrative. So, this is obviously our service. You log in and what you first have effectively is session search. So again, for those of you who have seen a lot of operational tools, the idea that you can pull up a session is nothing new necessarily. What is new and important to understand though about our tools and like what we're able to do is we're basically able to like let you look across every single case by case ID. So we basically marry all the case sessions up. We allow you to kind of cut the data in all sorts of ways. So you can add criteria like a timestamp, or I want to look at a customer, or a certain page tool, or an outlier. And then when you click in, you effectively can replay, what happened on the case. And not only are you getting kind of the actual like visual, obviously, we can say, okay, this is what's happening, and like, it's replaying this way. And like in this case, this is all scripted. So like the bot we were running like went to YouTube and hung out for a while to like show a distraction case. But you can add annotations, you can make clips shareable, you can link to it, things like that. And it's all kind of backed by our Fin data, which allows you to go to exactly the right place and replay exactly what you need. What you see down here and just load it in is effectively you have effectively the case session. So you see these are the different cases the person's working on. They worked on this case, flipped to this case briefly, went back to this one, etc. And then you see kind of the pages or the tool the person's using. Again, this is all a scripted bot, so it's kind of not moving the mouse, but you get the idea that you can kind of see into every single tool they're using and where they're doing and how they're doing their work to complete the case across all the tools. When you flip around and look at the data, like again, I'll show you the standard stuff just so you get a sense of kind of what Fin does high level with the data we're able to provide, and we can get into some of the case studies. But obviously we have some sort of an executive summary, which gives you things like our understanding of true utilization across your whole team and true handle time of cases. We'll get into a little more detail on that. You can look at like the time distribution of where time is being spent at a high level, outliers, so you can understand exactly, where the longest session cases, what are contributing to outliers, et cetera. And then what we show here is an opportunities waterfall that kind of walks you down from a engagement utilization perspective. What is the opportunity of closing issues in that space? Workflows, coaching and training, outlier interactions. It basically can help you size kind of where to focus attention and the biggest opportunities to drive efficiency with your, in a lot of cases, remote team now. Utilization. So this is like one of those things where like in the end of the day, like you hire people for a certain number of hours and you have a yield of like how much productive time is coming out of that. And so from our perspective, like we're able to do this waterfall, obviously by partnership. This is a little bit deceiving in our demo organization, but you should imagine like you could have several partners, like one BPO, two BPOs, three BPOs, and they're kind of how they're behaving. Tier, so understanding by tier, okay, this is exactly, how our phone group versus tier 2 versus whatever is utilized. And then by person, obviously understanding their utilization. You can kind of look for people who are underutilized for whatever reason and debug these things. What's really important to understand about our utilization and why it's different and powerful is most companies or tools out there that talk about utilization will do something like the amount of time you hire someone or you're paying them to the amount of, at best, time that they're active on their computers, or case time, which is time they're active on their computers and in theory working on a case. Because we have the full waterfall of activity all the way down to effectively, when they're working in the right tools in the right places, we can give you a full waterfall that lets you know not just like, are the people technically active, but are they active on the right things and actually contributing to productive work. We have things like true handle time. So true handle time is another kind of the same type of concept where we can go kind of by partner group with BPO, by tier, by person, and then obviously because this is a handle time oriented thing, we can go by category, and then even into kind of within the category where time is spent in given categories. This is powerful because again, like one really powerful tool debugging tool, you can say, okay, I want to understand by each of my workflows how much time is being spent in the knowledge base. Like, okay, do we need to spend 3.5% of our knowledge base time in order status? Like that seems like a lot for what it is. Same thing with communications overhead. When you see task types with a lot of communication overhead, that means that like the directions of the steps probably could be less confusing. People are asking for help a lot of the time, so you can kind of debug what's going on there. Again, though, what the value of what we have with true handle time is that we're able to go all the way down. So like the tool activity level, so we know who's active on what tools and give you the distribution of the P20 to P80 by person or by tier. So you understand not just like in the abstract, what's the net handle time when someone picked up a case to finished it, but understand exactly how much time they're spending in the right tools driving outcome-oriented work. We talked about outliers again. Like I think you guys get the idea here. I'm obsessed with outliers. It just turns out to be so powerful to understand. By category, what is causing outlier cases, what percentage of time is spent on outliers, which people are drawing them. When you have someone who's like spending 50% of their time on outliers, or 20% of all the cases they touch become outliers, that's obviously a place for intervention. and the ability to actually go and replay exactly, what these outliers are, et cetera. When you get into kind of some more of the stuff that you really want to be able to do, especially in a remote work environment, I'll show you a few other of our key tools. One is kind of our process explorer. So, when you're in a live environment, you can kind of go and watch people work and understand a little bit of their process. It's still hard to do, honestly, but it's better in live. Once they're remote, it's really hard to know kind of how people are doing things. So our tools allow you to basically say, okay, by case type, at a sample rate, or by a person, or by a tier, how is work actually being completed step by step? And when you see super long tails, these are the places to start debugging where there's a lot of confusion or bobbling effectively that you can use to drive outcomes. Same thing with process flow diagrams, where time is being spent as a breakdown, which resources in the knowledge base or whatever are being used, things like that. So that's a really powerful tool around the remote work side for a kind of next level optimization. And then finally, I'd call out, things like understanding network, or I might call them one of this, which is understanding the network capabilities of where you're at. So in this case, again, this is a fake team, but you see like a set of resources that are using, including distraction resources like World of Solitaire, right? Active time, and then what percentage of time is being spent, and the cost of navigation. So it turns out different tools load at different speeds, right? And like you want to like target the places where you're seeing gaps with slow loading tools, or machines which are super slow, or individuals whose internet connections are slow, et cetera, and driving those. So there's a lot of depth you can get into. This is particularly important when you have remote working teams. I lied. I'm going to take you through one more thing before we go back to kind of the overview deck and kind of some of our thinking around this, which is a little bit around assisted resources. Again, this is a demo team, so this isn't going to be, but you'll get the idea from here, which is when you look at assisted resources, understanding effectively by case type, how much time is spent in communication tools, knowledge base, G Suite, understanding kind of the knowledge based resources in particular, like which pages are being hit and which are being used, which usually could be, cleaned up. Same thing with G Suite, if you're using G Suite or you have documents floating around in there. And then things like Google searches work as well, and Slack as well, so you can understand effectively which channels and which scenarios different things are being used to kind of optimize and kind of drive less usage around them. So yeah, I think with that kind of grounding a little bit in terms of how our tool works, where again, a plugin runs on every single machine, it generates this data, you can replay it, and you can cut and slice and dice it in a bunch of very powerful ways with a remote team to really give you that observability. Let's talk about specifically like why it's critical for a remote team. Is that what we're seeing? One thing we're seeing is that the shift to remote work is creating a big gap, as I said, in observability, and that really matters for remote utilization, coaching, feedback and issues. Even things like security and fraud, right, have come up a lot for us, and then IT and support issues around that. I won't go over this again because we kind of just talked about it, but you'll get, those are kind of some of the major categories that matter. We are in a lot of ways the best work from home solution because we have the completeness of data, which I've talked about. We have those QA targeted tools. And then one thing I haven't kind of hit on enough is like the cost of setup and integration. For teams that are using multiple tools, especially, it's super hard to like actually do the type of instrumentation we do any other way. In theory, you could do it from log files, but it's super hard to go deep enough, and do all that integration work. We work through Chrome over the top and are able to kind of just drive these outcomes very easily from there. In terms of what this actually payoff becomes, like, there are things people like to go to the really fancy stuff, but the reality is even at a super simple level, there's a bunch of stuff we can drive out of the box that are really impactful. Like, so I'll give you an example. Remote utilization. Once you have a bunch of people working from home, as a lot of teams do, just understanding what they're spending their time on in utilization becomes very difficult. And with our tools and our measure of true utilization, just delivering those reports to team leads, we've seen time and time again, helps to improve utilization quite dramatically. Because all of a sudden, like, rather than having some like inaccurate sense of what utilization looks like, you have the right sense of what utilization looks like. And, in the end of the day, like, you kind of get what you measure by showing this to the right team leads. You usually are able to drive it up pretty dramatically. The debugging of utilization capacity on individual team group level, I've talked about a little bit, but just to replay it a little bit, again, the ability to remotely understand capacity utilization by group and by time is super powerful for kind of targeting your effort. Understanding kind of like how things are trending over time and like what they're moving and be able to segment by BPOs is critical. And then obviously segmenting by person is like an ultimate tool where like, just because someone's utilization for a specific moment is low, that's not like in and of itself necessarily a huge problem, but over a long enough period of time, like you want basically your team members to be able to hit the utilization hurdles you've set. And if they're not, it's worth a conversation and intervention. Same thing with like targeted QA. Again, like we do allow you to kind of actually go and see like an individual dashboard per user and have that conversation with real data of what's going on. This is super valuable for having those one-on-one coaching conversations remotely, right? That help people actually get the outcomes they're looking for in terms of it. So if that's like the utilization story, let's talk about like, again, my favorite hobby horse, which is like traditional AHT versus true handle time. This is just like, I'm probably weirdly obsessed with this, but our understanding of a handle time is driven by actual time working on workflows, on a specific case. It's not how active are you on a computer, which is sometimes how people think about, some of this stuff. It certainly isn't like net case time. It's literally like, were you on the case? Were you actively engaged in it? And then which tools were you using? Were you using the tools that actually drive towards conclusions, or were you playing solitaire? Right. And so understanding that full sense of resolution and cost of the resolution is super important. And understanding the distribution is super important. This idea that like averages can be highly influenced by outliers. So you might have so if you only look at average, we'd say, take all net time spent on a case type by cases and like understand that, you're going to end up with very skewed metrics. When you start looking at kind of what's the actual P50 versus the P80 versus the P20 by person or by case type, that's where you start to get the real insight and the granular insight into where to focus your attention to drive outcomes and results. This kind of true handle time allows for like way better coaching and QA, because it also means like you can go and review the actual specific case types and people on case types where there's the biggest gaps, and have that kind of real conversation off of real data, replaying real cases to understand kind of how to coach and how to do a better job versus kind of being too abstract. And again, like we can even get into stuff like one of my favorite things about handle time and like is like it actually allows you to start doing things like the cost of customer overall, where you can kind of look by customer and understand exactly what their cost structure is, and think about even bigger term concepts, like thinking about a little bit how you think about lifetime value of a customer versus the lifetime support cost, and starting moving towards thinking of support as a thing that can expand LTV rather than it's purely a cost center. We talked a little about, I showed you some of our process exploration tools, but where they get really, really powerful as you think about it in the context of continuous improvement. So again, like we are able to give you this process insight and the process flow diagram, starting with, every case and what the distribution is of work by step on those cases. And also then looking at specific steps and driving kind of a timeline for those processes. We can break those down by like things like web searches and communication tools to understand on a specific case at a specific point what types of resources are being used the most, which allows you to really go deep and understand like what to optimize. And then we allow you to kind of give you this like in context remote feedback loop, where because you can send feedback directly in, you can kind of link this all in and take the actual voice of the user into the context of kind of the debugging conversation as well. This is a very powerful tool for engaging people. So I think all of this kind of couples together and shows you a little bit of kind of our tools in terms of how we think about saying you have a given case type, you're trying to make it more efficient, you're trying to get the voice of the customer involved, the voice of the agent involved in kind of driving those outcomes. And this is kind of how you think about our tools as part of that full loop observability, even when your team is remote, to get the data you need and get the input and the buy-in even you need to kind of drive performance improvement. So we've talked a little bit about kind of like average handle time and kind of what we can do from a remote basis, utilization, which again, it's super basic time tracking stuff, but our version is way more powerful. We've talked a little bit about kind of the process component of what we do and how you can think about understanding processes remotely and driving them. The last thing I just want to hit on is a little bit about, how we think about remote technology issues, security, and compliance. This is kind of a new category that's newly relevant for us given kind of the work from home environment. So we talked a little bit, and I showed you some of the tools around system speed and network performance, but this is actually really important. The reality is like the second you have a bunch of employees that are using different internet connections at home, understanding how their tools are performing, their CRM versus the knowledge base, internal tool trackers, et cetera, is super critical to actually driving the outcomes that you're looking for, right? And so, in the end of the day, it's like if you're losing a ton of agent time because people's internet connections are slow, or if people's, their average handle time is bad because their tools are bad or they're not loading properly, is really important to know or be able to debug those holistically. Security and compliance, same thing. It's like, look, you no longer have control of someone's entire environment that they're working in. And so the ability to do screen recording plus data, allows you to trace things like, okay, like, is someone driving too many refunds, and like why? Let's go like replay it and watch it, and understand what's going on, right? Like, are someone's behavior patterns on a specific workflow not consistent, or are they doing weird things? Like, again, in the end of the day, when you have a complete data layer, you can do very powerful stuff with this. So again, those are some of like the areas where like people end up using Fin, for tools. Again, utilization, understanding handle time remotely, understanding how to do process improvement, and then obviously kind of this like whole hodgepodge of questions that you start asking about your remote work team, from security to network performance. So the last thing we're going to talk about is just like an automation example, how you drive continuous improvement with Fin. And like the thing I like to level set on here with people is just like this kind of cycle we like to talk teams through around how to identify opportunities, prioritize them and drive outcomes. Where basically what you do is you choose a success metric, you segment your data, you identify outliers, you perform root cause analysis, you kind of discover the correlated funnel metrics, you change things, you track them, and then you track the outcome. This is like very generic. This is how we think about prioritizing, what to go after, and then how to drive kind of continuous feedback loops. There's nothing super custom about this, but it's important to level set on when you have a new data set like Fin, how it works. So let's think about opportunity identification. You might look at something like, okay, segmenting the data based on work category and our ops spend. And you see that like, all right, people are spending 36% of their time on missing packages, right? You say, okay, well, like why? You kind of go down a level further, and you can start understanding, exactly what the ROI is, given the team size and given kind of what that is, when you kind of pop it up and say, does it work? So we're able to kind of look at a detail there. You're able to look at things like, okay, there's across a set of task types, you can look at different partners, right? So on BPO 1 and BPOs 2, you can see, okay, in BPO 1, their dental claim number in terms of the amount of time, their true handle time is like off the charts, right? That becomes an opportunity to look at, where you're like, that kind of pops out the second you start looking by task type and partner group. You can visualize where processes deviate. And again, we talked about kind of our process tools. Once you kind of dove in and you said, okay, we found the opportunity, like we identified the space to go. And the next question is like, why or what's going on? And again, we have a bunch of tools that allow you to do that remotely. Root cause analysis, you can kind of go a step further and look at specifically, okay, is there a problem around help resources? Or is this a problem people just aren't active in Chrome? You can look at specific elements in that, and then dive all the way down and say, okay, like, is there a problem around translation, et cetera? Let's resolve it. Let's rewatch it. Let's confirm this is what's going on. Let's rinse and repeat. So again, just going back to the cycle here, I think the point is that we kind of give you, and there's a bunch of examples of this, that we've sprinkled throughout, this ability to like really start by saying, we want to drive down AHT. We want to, on the specific case type, how do you segment the data, understand, is it a problem with specific people, a specific BPO, a specific step in a specific process? You identify those outliers, you confirm it with video that that's actually what's going on, and then you kind of rinse and repeat in terms of the process you're running. So I guess in conclusion, before we jump into the Q&A and like anything else coming up, I just kind of point out the fact that like, in the end of the day, this concept of like you need full process observability in order to drive scientific process improvement for operations teams has always been true. There's nothing like fundamentally new about that in a work from home environment. I think what has changed though, and what makes a big difference, is now that teams have kind of started working from home, any old version of observability you might have manually had by walking the floor, or talking to agents, whatever, has gone out the window. And what that means is that it's a great opportunity to kind of move towards more modern tooling for observability with a tool like Fin, where you can see across all your tools the continuous data, use it for a bunch of the obvious stuff out of the box, like understanding obviously remotely, again, utilization, handle time, whatever. But there's a huge amount of depth you can go into once you have those tools for higher level analyses and opportunity identification and optimization once you have that in line. So thanks for kind of like, hanging in there for a spiel on this. With that, I think we'll talk about Q&A a little bit. All right. So the two questions I have up so far, and please, if you have other questions, pop them into Q&As. Will you provide a PDF of these slides? Sure. That's an easy answer, Dan. And I guess the question is, oh, I see how this works. I don't know how to actually use Zoom. The second question that came up is what team types and sizes do you think are ideal for this type of tool? That's a great question. So what we've found is basically there's three types of teams or sizes of teams where Fin can apply. The first and most obvious is like very large teams. So if you have a 10,000 person operations team or a 1,000 person operations team across multiple service centers, Fin's a really powerful tool at a data level because it's just really hard to understand what's going on in the detail at scale, right? And so that's like obvious, and candidly, that's like a lot of the teams we work with are kind of at that scale. Then there's kind of a click stop we've noticed around 100 people. And at 100 people, there's like this interesting thing going on where like you're big enough that you start caring about efficiency and you do have standardized processes and things like that, but you're small enough that you can still kind of establish new norms very easily, right? In some ways, like the 1,000-person teams or the huge teams, you know, with multiple BPOs, the good news is there's a huge amount of leverage in the tools at the data level. The bad news at the challenge level is like, it still is hard to change process even when you have the answers. Like you will get wins, but it's still difficult to manage any large team like that. At the 100 scale, you basically have the ability to both have the nimbleness of a small team where you can make really big changes really quickly, but you have enough users on the platform where like the data is meaningful, right? You're getting real outlier data, you're getting real handle times, you have big enough samples for it to be a meaningful data set. We do work with some very small teams, right? So there are people who have like 10 agents or something like that that work with us. At that level, you know, the reality is you usually don't have enough data density to have really precise, deep introspection into exactly each process and things like that. Like the reality is a lot of those charts I was showing you where you kind of say like, this is how like a sample of 1,000 cases was done in this way. That's just not going to happen with a team of 10. But what we can provide, and where those tools are really valuable, is like the video coaching and QA, a lot of the remote work, you know, debugging. Usually very small teams actually have less well-defined processes. And so the ability to flag something, raise a hand, say, hey, I need help on this, or I need a manager to review this, or, you know, I need help figuring this out is actually quite good. So we do work with teams across the full broad spectrum. What tools in CRM do you integrate with? So great question. So the answer is the kind of the whole point of Fin is that because we sit on the browser and look at the DOM, we integrate with everything out of the box. Like you don't actually need custom integrations. Like any tool you bring to us, we can measure because we basically can see what the agent can see. So anything they're seeing is on our screen, and we can kind of capture data and structure around and help you analyze. Now that said, we do deeper integrations with several tools that are kind of used by lots of people. So for instance, you know, a Salesforce Service Cloud, a Zendesk, Customer, Five9s. Like if you're in the kind of modern operations world, there is a bunch of stuff that's pretty standard or used by a lot of teams or a lot of modern teams that we do deeper integrations with, because once we've done an API connection, we can pull data, for instance, task types that might never even appear to the agent, right? Or maybe you have CSAT scores associated to your Zendesk cases and you want to pull those into Fin so that you can start cutting or replaying video sections or doing analysis based on CSAT. That's the type of stuff we can do with some of those integrations that are a little bit deeper. We do have very robust APIs for both pulling in data and also letting you sync out our data into your own data warehouses for other types of analyses. So you can do things like we've had teams, for instance, do custom instrumentation where they're firing specific errors directly into Fin so they can go replay exactly when those errors happen really easily and do analysis on them. But I guess the point that, you know, when you ask like what CRMs do we integrate with, is we do integrate with a bunch of the ones you'd expect in a very traditional way. But if you're running a homegrown CRM or something we've never seen before, we've built the infrastructure to do DOM parsing, URL parsing, whatever, so that we actually can run case sessions even without that level of integration. Any other questions? All right. Well, here's what I'd say in closing. Again, you know, to be a little bit of a broken horse and talk my own book, but have belief at least. You know, I think when you think about the next 5 to 10 years, this theme of like effectively knowledge work visibility is going to be huge. And it's going to be huge just because we've seen the future with our own tools, and we can tell you that there's an enormous amount of leverage in having the true observability in a structured data set of exactly what's happening for scientific process optimization. You know, COVID's really unfortunate. It's pushed, obviously, the work from home narrative much faster than anyone expected. And it's in some ways, ironically, just driven the demand for our tools much higher and much faster, because a lot of the things I'm talking about, they're not any less true in traditional service centers, but the world of operations has been so fundamentally shook up that people understand really deeply that they do need to understand these things for the whole team when they're remote, so that they can just provide better experiences and help teams work better. In the end of the day, I think this observability trend and like building out data sets like Fin of continuous operations work is going to be really good for companies because you're going to be able to drive efficiency and quality, but it's also going to be really good for teams. And I think this is something that sometimes people gets lost is, if you work in a traditional operations environment, there is a lot of tension between your human operations teams and the people working on your tools and the people working on your process. And the reason there's this tension is you just get stuck in this world where, the people who are working on tools don't understand the human side and they're upset when things go wrong. They think everything's a human problem. The teams working on it, they see a lot of the problems with process and tools, but they don't know how to get that feedback back. Like everyone's kind of angry at everyone else on some level, even on really healthy teams. And once you kind of have a full data set and full transparency, it's much easier to have open and honest conversations about kind of where the gaps are and work on them as a team together collaboratively. So I'm really excited about that future and kind of the value that some transparency can bring to the whole ecosystem of operations. So thank you for taking the time. I'll hang out for one more second in case anyone has the last late breaking question. And obviously, if you want to follow up with us, and ask any questions, we're here to support all the teams that are going through this transition. All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.